This is not a warning, it's a record. Project Sunshine was never about light. It was about control and silence. The truth is buried here.
Imagine this. A government scientist opens a locked cabinet. Inside are small glass jars. Each jar is labeled with a date, a city, and a number. Not classified weapon parts, no. Not alien artifacts either. Just pieces of human bone. And the strangest part? Most of those bones came from people who never agreed to be a part of any experiment. Some, they were children. Others, babies. Tonight, we're talking about a Cold War project so quiet, so clinical, and so morally disgusting that when the public finally learned about it, the reactions ranged from disbelief to even pure rage. This is the story of Project Sunshine, a program meant to answer one of many terrifying questions. How much radioactive fallout was the world absorbing, and how much of it was building up inside of us? And while you watch this, ask yourself one thing. If the government needed your body to prove a point, do you really think that they would be asking first?
Cold breath rising through the wall, secrets buried long ago still whisper where the shadows grow. Eyes are watching from the night, shapes that move outside the light. Every story leaves a trace, something here you can't erase. Truth in the shadow, calling you.
And this would be chapter 1. The problem nobody wanted to really say out loud. So to understand why Project Sunshine even existed, we need to go back to the moment where the world kind of realized nuclear weapons did not end with just the blast. They kept going in air, in the rain, in the soil, even in the food chain. When atomic tests scaled up after World War II, governments faced a new kind of fear. Not a fear of invasion, not missiles, but something slow, very invisible, and very global. Radioactive fallout, actually. Now, here's the nightmare, the real terrifying part. If a test throws particles high enough into the atmosphere, those particles have to circulate the planet, and they will. They can fall weeks later, months later, literally half a world away. Officials had a problem. People were asking questions now. Scientists were arguing, and data was not clean enough to settle really anything. How dangerous is this fallout? At what dose, especially, and to whom, and for how long? One isotope became the star of the story. Strontium 90. It's produced in nuclear fission. It spreads throughout fallout. And your body can mistake it for calcium, actually, which means instead of passing through you, it can lodge into your bones. Now think about who grows the most bone. Children, babies, 6-year-olds even. Their bodies are building skeletons at full speed, meaning if strontium 90 is in the environment, it has a target. Once you understand that, then Project Sunshine stops sounding like a rumor and starts sounding more like an inevitable, because in the Cold War, at least in their mindset, if you can measure it, you can manage it. And if you can manage it, you can keep it going. Now, the day fallout became personal, I will say there is a moment in the Cold War when fallout stops being abstract and becomes a face. A village, a ship, a child. One reason, though, Sunshine is so eerie is that it grows out of a bigger pattern. Early nuclear testing was not perfectly controlled. And when mistakes happen, people far from the blast zone could still be exposed. There are historical examples where fallout moved beyond what planners had expected, however, where the wind did not cooperate, where the cloud carried material further than predicted, where communities later described a strange powder, a dust that felt like snow almost. In that era, governments faced a terrifying PR problem. If fallout harmed people, the world would demand limits, but if the effects were subtle and delayed, it would be easier to deny and minimize, or just bury it in technical language, which is kind of, yeah, I don't agree with that, but shocker. So the race began, though, not just to build bigger weapons, but to define what safe even meant. And here's the catch: you cannot define safe without measuring exposure. You have to be able to measure the exposure. So milk sampling was one thing, soil sampling was one thing, but Sunshine aimed for the final proof. Not what was in the environment, but what was inside of the people like me and you. If your government told you, don't worry, it's within limits, would you really trust them? Think about it. Or would you just want to see your own bones? Now, part of this would be onto the Fallout debate. Why the numbers alone were just a battlefield, if I'm being completely honest. To understand the mindset behind Sunshine, you do need to understand one phrase that quietly shaped the entire nuclear era: maximum permissible dose. It sounds scientific, it sounds careful, it's also political, however, because the moment you define a permissible dose, you also define what level of harm is acceptable. In the 1950s, however, the world was still arguing about basic radiation questions. Is the dose response linear? Do tiny exposures add up over time, maybe? What matters more, one big hit or many small hits over many years? Now, layer it in with something even scarier. External exposure certainly is one thing. You stand near a source, you step away, but internal exposure is different. If strontium 90 is in your bones, you cannot step away from that. The source is simply inside of you, which is terrifying. So, Sunshine is about internal exposure, about radioactive elemental becomings that eventually become part of your body. And if that sounds like a nightmare, trust me, it is. That's because it really is. It's terrifying. This is also why public debate became so intense. Protesting voices wanted to say it is low, it's manageable, and it is worth it. Anti-testing voices wanted to say it's cumulative, it's hidden, and you are dosing children. So the fight wasn't just about the bombs. It was about proof, and proof lives in bodies. Now, what Project Sunshine actually was, it wasn't just a single lab. It was not just a building or just a small area. It was an entire network. A coordinated effort to measure how much strontium 90 was accumulating in human bone at the time. That sentence is the official version of what's on documents. Now, here's the part that makes people lean back from the screen, because to measure strontium 90 in human bone, you need human bones. And a lot of it, too. From different ages, different regions, different years, repeated over time. Sunshine depended on samples collected from autopsies, from hospitals, from pathology departments, even. Not only that, they went to morgues, from places where bodies pass through systems and where paperwork can be completely overwritten and complicated. In the Cold War mind, this was public health, a grim kind of environmental monitoring. But in the public mind, when it became known, it sounded like body snatching. Like a secret trade, a quiet chain of custody almost. A shipment you've never even knew existed. Moving through the night silently. And it did not stop at one country, because Fallout did not stop at borders. It has no borders. The question was global, so the collection became global. Now, to be completely clear, Project Sunshine is something blended in online retellings with other radiation era studies, but Sunshine at its core is about one simple cold fact. They wanted a hard number for fallout in human bodies, and bone was the most reliable record. Now, chapter 5 of this story is called The Bone Library and how the world became a data set, really. This is where Sunshine becomes unsettling in very specific ways, because it is one thing to measure fallout, is another thing to build a library of human remains just to study it. Think about this world and how it would look inside the project, not as a horror movie, but as an inventory, as a list with ages, categories, locations, dates, codexes of infant, children, parent, adult, elder, seemingly every role society has to play. And because fallout levels do change over time, the sampling had to repeat year after year, like a census. But instead of counting people, it counted what the bomb left behind. In the project's mindset, at least, each sample is a data point. In the public mindset, each sample is a violation. And the tension between those two mindsets is the heartbeat of this episode, because if you accept the project logic, Sunshine can look like a grim necessity. If you reject it, Sunshine looks like a program that treated human bodies exactly like property, like they belong to certain governments. Which side really are you on? Public health or on the darker side? Because inside the lab, it's where clinical becomes truly terrifying. So let's get a little technical here, in a way that makes Dread even more sharper, because the science here is very real, and the science is what made Sunshine valuable. Strontium-90 behaves exactly like calcium, as we discussed, so if fallout puts strontium-90 in the soil, plants absorb it, animals eat the plants, milk carries it even, and humans drink that milk. That milk deposits into the human bone. Once it's in the bone, it can remain there for years, which means bone becomes a long-term record, a timeline. It's a receipt. Now imagine the lab routine. Simply a sample arrives, it gets logged, then prepared. It's processed in a way, though, that removes the human story from it, not because the scientists are monsters, but because the work requires emotional distance. The real point is to isolate a number, a count, a concentration, a curve showing the world trending up or down. But here's why it's so creepy. A system can do something ethically wrong, yeah, of course, and still feel normal on the inside, of course. Paperwork, however, routine, lab coats, result meetings, and graphs. That's really where the true horror of this story begins, because it's a horror story where everyone screams and it's obvious. Sunshine really is a horror story where everyone is just acting calm. Because what is strontium-90? What does that number even mean? When people hear strontium-90 in bone, they imagine glowing skeletons, ghouls like from Fallout. That's not what it is. This horror here is quieter. It's a probability, it's a risk, a small increase that becomes real when you scale it to millions of people. Strontium-90 has a long half-life, so once it's in the environment, it stays. Once it's in the bone, it stays. And while the body slowly eliminates some of it, there is still a constant presence, a tiny internal emitter. So Sunshine was trying to answer questions like, are levels rising year by year? Do children show higher uptake? Even do certain regions have higher concentrations due to a diet or rainfall? Do policy changes even reduce the curve? That they were measuring everything, and it's really messed up if you think about it. And everything was an excuse to body snatch as well. So if you are an official, however, A curve is everything. A rising curve means political danger. A falling curve means you can claim control. A flat curve means you just get to keep testing. This is why Sunshine feels like a mystery project, because it sits behind a statement like there is no evidence of harm. The numbers are within limits and we are monitoring closely. Right. Okay. Monitoring is the key word. That word is extremely cold, brazen. But in Sunshine, monitoring meant something most would never agree to. That would be essentially the collection network, where this whole story starts to seem less eerie and more of a thrilling project. So once a project depends on quiet collection, it depends also on cooperation from hospitals, universities, public agencies, and even some contractors. A collection program that thrives on ambiguity. A sample becomes a sample, a case becomes a number, a child becomes an age bracket. And once you reduce a person to a data category, it becomes easier to take what you need. You're no longer humanizing what the project is about. Depending on the place, the era, and the institution, consent practices range from documented to very unclear, to, in some accounts, completely absent. No paperwork whatsoever. And that uncertainty part is what keeps Sunshine extremely haunting in my eyes, because the public never got one single clean explanation ever. They got fragments, and the fragments breed extreme distrust. Now, do not go gory, go clinical. That is the scarier choice, because the horror is how normal it actually can look. In that era where incentives, funding, prestige, equipment access, and the soft pressure of national interest, when you wrap any act in national interest, people do things they would never do just on their own. So things like consent, law, and the gray zone become into play. One reason Sunshine is so hard to pin down is simple. Terms, or it is in simple terms, that the laws and norms around tissue use change dramatically over age, or over the last few decades at least. In some places, hospitals historically treated removed tissues as medical waste. In others, families assumed the body would remain intact. In many cases, though, the rules were not clear to the average person. And that is the perfect environment for a program like Sunshine, because if consent is ambiguous, the program really can't operate without obvious resistance. If the public never hears about it, there is no pressure to clarify any rules. There are no rules. This is where the horror becomes social. Because Sunshine is not only about radiation, it's about power. Who has authority over your body and who has authority over your dead? And how quietly that authority can be exercised. So be honest, before this video, did you assume a hospital could never take tissue without asking? Because Sunshine alone proves and shows why people started demanding stronger protections over time. That's exactly what was happening. So let's dive into a little bit more about teeth, milk, and the war over the fallout real quick. Sunshine was not only a way for people who tried to track fallout, but some learned that you could track it fully in milk alone. Others found out that you could track it in the soil, and one of the most famous approaches was actually teeth. Baby teeth. Yeah. Because teeth, like bone, lock in elements as they form, a child's tooth becomes a tiny archive of the environment, a record of what the body absorbed. Fallout became political. Protest politicians wanted reassurance. Anti-test activists wanted absolute proof. Scientists were caught directly in the middle. And parents just wanted the truth. If Sunshine numbers rose, activists could point to danger. If Sunshine numbers fell, after policy change, officials could point to control. Either way, the numbers were power. Power that tries to end up controlling the numbers, which is the quiet horror of necessary science. And here is the moral trap. If you're a scientist in the 1950s and you believe strontium 90 might poison a generation, what do? You could test animals, you could test soil, but ultimately human biology is different. And yes, you could test milk, but milk levels might tell you what happened to a certain degree, not quite like bone. So the most direct answer, obviously, is to test humans. Except you can't ethically do that, and not openly, and not with consent, and not on children. So Sunshine slid into the gray zone, where people who were already dead would just have samples taken that were just tissue. Just tissue. No risk to the living at all. That was the justification, at least. But consent does not stop mattering because someone died. And that's what really makes a story linger and be an issue for me. Because if the public had been truly asked, the answer might have been no, and the data might have been slower. The nuclear policy would have been different. If officials came to you today and said, we need samples to keep the world safe, would you consent? What if they added, well, we've already started? Well, you're kind of SOL. So the audience for this is people like me who just care, but also think about it. If you're still here, you probably are realizing why this story is so disturbing. There is no monster, there is no masked killer. It's just institutions and the choices they make when they think nobody is watching. If you want more episodes like this, real projects, real documents, real history that feel like horror, hit like, subscribe, and turn on the notification, guys. I truly appreciate it, as always, because the next project on the list is going to be even harder to believe. Now back into the dark. When the public learns, everything turns into a fight. Imagine that. Projects like Sunshine thrive on visibility, not always total secrecy. Just enough technical language, though, to keep the story off of the front page. But eventually, stories do leak. Journalists find documents, officials are questioned, and archives are open. Once the public sees the words human bone next to a government study, it lands like betrayal. At least for me it does. Because the public doesn't hear strontium 90 essays. They took bones, they took tissue, they did it without asking. That's what we hear. And that's what happened. Then the questions do multiply, however, where it becomes more of a where did they come from? Who authorized this? Who knew? Who benefited from it? Was this even legal? Is this ethical? And why does the name sound so cheerful? Well, this is where the mystery becomes modern, because once the public asks questions, the paper trail becomes a battlefield. Some documents are available, some are redacted, some are just straight up missing. Shocker. Some are technically public, but only if you know exactly what you're searching for. If you're trying to hide if you were trying to hide a morally explosive program, what would you do? Would you call it secret bone collection of dead people testing because we almost blew up and killed hella people after the fact? No. You'd want to name it something that's positive, like Project Sunshine. This is where the ethics really comes into play, because the dead cannot sign a form, guys. So let's talk about the defenses you will hear from programs like this. They were already dead. The samples were small. The data saved lives. It influenced the safer policy. Now, some of that may be true, but ethics is not about outcomes. Ethics is also about the process and dignity. It's about trust. About whether people are treated as citizens or as just raw material. Sunshine exists in an era where ethics rules were very much so still forming, when some agencies treated ethics like a luxury. So when Sunshine was revealed, people don't just judge it alone. They judge it as part of a pattern. A pattern that says when officials believe the stakes are high enough, the public and their safety becomes optional. Even if you believe Sunshine had good intentions, this method damages trust no matter what. And when trust collapses, every future public health message becomes harder and harder to believe. That's why the mystery angle behind this all is really something that we still don't know. You can find proof that Sunshine existed. You can find technical discussions blah, 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 of strontium 90, and you can find references of bone sampling, but you will also find major gaps. And gaps is really where the dread lives. Questions that remain important. And this is partially my POV, but gathered from a list of people. How standardized was consent across every institution? Were families ever even informed after the fact? How were samples selected? Was it random? Was it biased? How much documentation was kept for a chain of custody? Where does Sunshine boundaries blur into other fallout studies? And the biggest question of all, did the project change its policy, or did the policy use the project? Like, really, it comes down to basic data can protect the public, but data can also be used to say, see, it's safe while testing continues. So have you noticed how the same study can be used to argue both sides? This is what makes Sunshine so unsettling. The truth can be real and still weaponized. Now, how to investigate this even further? More FOIAs, the Freedom of Information Act, and archive strategy is what I call it. So this part is for the audience members that want their receipts to double check all this. I'll have links below. But PDF scans, microfilm, library stacks, agency reading rooms, etc. You can also just Freedom of Information Act a lot of this stuff, which I plan on doing. But if you want to chase Sunshine documentation, you're usually going to be looking for fallout monitoring reports, anything containing strontium 90, essay discussions, meeting minutes about fallout research priorities, contracts tied to radiological monitoring, and university labs doing isotopes, especially during these times. Now, the creator-friendly method would be like anything else. Identify the likely institutions, search archives, file specific requests. Not everything, though, about Project Sunshine. Maybe SR90 infant bone, fallout essays, just think about it. Research isn't that hard to do, and once you start knowing the keywords, you can find a lot. A lot of the missing pieces. Once you find like a name, then you find a lab, then you find consistency that's built within that. And I'm telling you, I've come across quite a bit. I am going to put a portfolio together. It won't be done for a while, but I will have it up on the website. If you want to, please, if you like the video, go ahead and comment Sunshine down below. Let me know if you want me to even compile all that. Now back to the story. And this is where it really matters. Every sample did come from a person, a family, and a funeral, a grieving family that had to attend the funeral even. In many retellings, the most painful detail is not the science, but the feeling of violation that someone took away from not just you, but your loved one. And imagine never being told that. Not because we want to shock, but because we want to remember these stories that become what they are when they're reduced over time or reduced in number. That's why we cover these stories. So not only that, we want to be fair, respectful, and the goal is not to claim every scientist was evil. They really weren't. The goal is to show how systems normalize the unthinkable, how good intentions can exist alongside very, very bad methods, and how secrecy turns public health into seemingly a ghost story. Now, why does this keep happening? Sunshine is not the only government-linked system treating bodies like data. History is full of cases where medical material was used without meaningful consent, sometimes for breakthroughs or for convenience. Sometimes because nobody thought the public would ever even notice. Well, guess what? We did. What Sunshine adds is the Cold War flavor, the emergency mindset, that sense of urgency, the argument that makes it seem like the stakes are so high and normal rules really shouldn't apply. That's a pattern. This is a pattern. Crisis, secrecy, normalization, panic, even. Then years later, exposure, outrage. Now, reform. And the quiet question is, how much did we ever learn? That's why The Name That Really Lied is a better title for this. Why Sunshine was the perfect cover, maybe. Because the name alone is a code name. They're not random. None of their code names are. They're chosen sometimes for security, sometimes for morale, but also sometimes because a harmless name makes a hard thing easier to do. It does not sound like Fallout. It doesn't sound like death. It doesn't sound like children. It sounds like a school program, like public health campaigns, even. And something you would really be okay with if you saw on a poster or a movie poster. Like, just think about it. And that really does matter because language shapes all the behavior. If you tell a staff member this is part of Sunshine, the mind relaxes. If you tell them this is part of the post-mortem collection of pediatrical skeletal material to measure internal contamination, they're not going to really be too happy about that. The mind hesitates heavily. In bigger institutions, pardon me, names do three things. They reduce curiosity, they reduce resistance, and they reduce accountability. And that's because if a scandal breaks into the public, we're going to ask, who authorized this? It's much easier to hide behind the label than it is to have, your name. So it was Sunshine, it was routine, it was technical, it was handled by another office. And if you want the creepiest detail of all, Sunshine is the kind of name that could slip into a meeting agenda without raising eyebrows. An assistant types it, a supervisor signs it, a file folder then gets stamped. And nobody outside that room understands the weight of what that word even represented. Now, this is why Sunshine is such a good topic for this channel. It's not just scary, it's not just instructive. It shows how horror can be bureaucratic, how it can be organized, how it can be filed, which is scary because it's right in front of us. Now, there was a fact of there was fighting over the curve that we discussed earlier. And basically, I just want you to picture yourself in a room. This is not specific documented meeting. This is a realistic reconstruction of how these conversations tend to happen. This is a dramatized scene based on institutional logic, not a quote. So a conference table, ashtrays, coffee, a projector, a line graph. A curve then goes up on that wall. Maybe it goes down. One person says, the curve is rising. Another says, but it's still within limits. Another says the limits are based on assumptions. Then one says, the public cannot handle the nuance. And then the sentence that always appears in one form or another. We need better data. Because better data does sound better. It sounds like you're being responsible. It sounds cautious, like protection almost. But sometimes better data is also a delay tactic, a way to keep doing what you're doing while you measure the consequences. It's like saying, I'll be there in a minute while you're still doing something wrong. This is core tension. So Sunshine could get framed as protection, or it could be framed as permission even. Protection, we need to know about it to keep people safe. As for the permission side, we need to know how far we can go. And the scariest part is, both can be true simultaneously. A person can believe that they are protecting the public while serving the institution that benefits from the measurements. Now, When you hear the phrase within permissible limits, remember this: limits are negotiable. Limits get updates. Limits are influenced by data you choose to collect and the data you choose to not collect. The most important data is inside the human body, that's a fact. Then the body becomes basically the final battleground. And that's why sunshine feels like it vanishes, like an archived ghost almost. If you're looking for Project Sunshine, you will not usually find a neat public website that says, here you go, here's everything you need. Our bad. You find fragments, like a reference in a report, a line in a memo, a budget entry, maybe even a list of sample categories, even a contract's name. That's why the story hits so hard like a mystery, because the project was designed to be technical. And technical projects can hide right in front of our faces. A spreadsheet in the basement, a file cabinet in the archive, a microfilm reel that nobody has touched in 30 years, still in plain sight. This is also why people argue about sunshine online, however. One person finds a document and says, see, it happened exactly like this. Another person says, where's the proof of consent? Another just says, you're mixing multiple programs together. And the truth is, all of that could be partly true, because the Cold War was created, and when it was, an ecosystem of radiological monitoring became huge. Sunshine was part of that system, whether or not you want to believe it. It was part of that ecosystem, where other programs did run alongside it. Some were semi-open, some were very secretive. And decades later, when you pull one, you just got to pull on one of the threads, and it tangles with all of the other cases. So here's the responsible way to present sunshine, to separate what's clearly documented. The focus, yeah, strontium-90 in the human bone. That's true. Their goal of monitoring accumulation over time, their existence of coordinated sample analysis from what often was called or alleged to be unclear, the exact consent practices at specific institutions and that going just completely oversight and not required, the exact scope of international collection networks, and the full chain of custodies for specific samples. The full chain can't be traced. If you want to keep the tone scary without going into so much rumor, lean into the certainty that is already horrifying. A government-linked system wanted bone. It got bone. Much of the world didn't understand that until later, and that is all you need to know. If you want a series, if this episode made your skin crawl a little bit more, I have good news, or bad news maybe. Sunshine isn't the only project like this. The bad news is Sunshine isn't the only project like this. There are other Cold War era programs involving open air tests, environmental releases, and classified research priorities. Some of them have paperwork you can still pull today. If you want a series called The Projects They Swear You Never Heard of, maybe, or if you got a good idea for a project name that chases all this, go ahead and let me know down below. I promise you I'll get working on it immediately. I love doing these deep dives for y'all, and I love writing this out. So, to finish up, Project Sunshine was built to measure what Fallout was doing to the world, but it also measured something else. It measured how quickly a society can trade consent for certainty. If you want the sources and the image pack for this episode, including declassified documents and license-safe visuals, go ahead and comment Sunshine sources. I'm going to get the video up before I do anything else. The description might be a little lackluster for the first few days because I've got to gather all the sources I used. And I want to make sure it looks clean for you guys. So if you did make it this far, you already know what to do, guys. Again, thank you so much. Please like, subscribe, comment. It helps me out. It helps you guys know when the next video is. And please tell me, what's the scariest government project you've heard of, and one that you'd like me to deep dive on? Till then, guys, I hope you have an amazing day. Thank you again for stopping by, And until I see you again, make sure you keep those lanterns lit.